to address us. He addresses not only us in Tobago, he addresses Trinidad and Tobago, he addresses the Caribbean, and his address will be international. Welcome, sir, and we look forward to what you have to say to all of us.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Mack, if I may call you that. The Chief Secretary is not here, but Secretary Jack and all the other secretaries, all the other administrators, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. The question of internal self-government for Tobago is once more on the front burner. The Prime Minister has announced that the issue will soon go to a joint select committee of Parliament. Already the commentariat have begun speculating and making recommendations on what internal self-government should entail. Reggie Dumas has commented recently on the multifarious understandings articulated over the years as to what might constitute internal self-government for Tobago. My sense, though, is that much of the debate and discussion has been limited and framed in political or constitutional law terms. I don't propose to engage the issue in terms of politics or constitutional law, but rather from the perspective of strategy and economics. And I will attempt to assess what the social and economic considerations might influence the shape, form, and content of internal self-government. I think that this input could be important because we might well have our politicians and lawyers devise a structure and then find out that there are a host of social and economic consequences which could compromise the success of the structure that they implement. Strategy consultants, like myself, understand that structure follows strategy, and strategy requires a clear-eyed analysis of the problem or situation to be addressed. So at some level, we need to ask, what problem does internal self-government solve? And what problems can internal self-government create, if not conceptualized and implemented properly? I think it is better for us to address these issues ex ante, as it were, rather than ex post, when the die may have already been cast in law. The angle from which I propose to engage this issue is whether we can learn anything from the policies and experiences of other small island developing and developed states, and whether we can distill and then insert those lessons into the considerations which will occupy the minds of our politicians and constitutional lawyers over the next several months. Now, over the last several decades, there has been extensive policy discussions and proposals on small island developing states. Small states began to receive attention from the international community in the 1970s. And from the 1960s, newly independent small states had joined the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank in increasing numbers, such as Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the Caribbean. Initially, the discussion was focused on the implication of international monetary and exchange arrangements for small states and led to the formation of the Group of 24, which was at one time chaired by Victor Bruce, eminent son of Tobago and Trinidad and former governor of the central bank. A so-called Small States Forum evolved at the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank in the 1980s. And the Commonwealth Secretariat also undertook a Small States initiative around that time, which did excellent research. And we must remember that Sridhar Ramphal of Guyana was, in fact, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat at that time. Small island developing states were recognized as a special category by the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. In 1994, there was a global conference which evolved the Barbados Program of Action. And then in 2005, there was a so-called Mauritius strategy for the implementation of the Barbados Program of Action. Now, small island developing states are a subcategory of small states. Within the category of small states, there are island states, landlocked states, developed states, and developing states. Small size is defined both by population and by land mass. Now, even within the grouping of small island states, there is considerable diversity. Some, like Trinidad and Tobago, Cyprus, Malta, and Singapore, are quite close to large land masses, while others, like the Pacific Islands, are hundreds of miles from continental land masses. Some of these states enjoy very high per capita incomes and are classified among developed countries. New Zealand, for example, comprises 2 main islands and many smaller islands, totaling 263,310 square kilometers and a population of 4.5 million. New Zealand, of course, is prone to earthquakes and has several active volcanoes and is 1,000 miles away from Australia. But New Zealand is a developed country. There are small states that are more or less ethnically homogeneous, and there are others which display considerable ethnic heterogeneity. Some analysts make a distinction between small states with less than 1 million people, so-called microstates, and those with over 1 million people, and those with less than 20,000 square miles of land area. We also have the seeming paradox that Belize, Guyana, and Suriname, which are of course not islands at all, are members of the United Nations Office of the High Representative for Landlocked and Small Island States. Now, there are several so-called stylized facts on small island states. They are held to suffer from several disabilities. Small populations, together with small landmass, means that markets are small, and they lack the ability to achieve economies of scale. This translates into higher costs of goods and services, including high costs for energy, infrastructure, transportation, and communications. Secondly, there is a lack of resilience to natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes. These states tend to have very fragile ecosystems. Natural disasters, such as a hurricane, for example, might affect the entire territory of the state, making response and recovery much more difficult. We see this very often in the Caribbean, most recently in Dominica, when a hurricane strikes. Tobago itself experienced considerable damage from Hurricane Flora in 1963. But in addition to these known risks, small island developing states are held to be particularly vulnerable to global climate change and the rise of sea levels, which is expected with global warming. Third, because small island states are necessarily much more open economies, they tend to be specialized in only a few sectors, and they therefore tend to be subject to large swings in their terms of trade, which in turn produces wide fluctuations in economic growth over short periods of time. In energy or mineral exporting countries like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, the cycle of commodity prices for oil, natural gas, bauxite, or gold may exacerbate the effects of the global business cycle. In some instances, these economies may face a perfect storm where falling commodity prices, falling exports, and global recession combine at the same time. While there is no global recession at this time, Trinidad and Tobago is certainly in the midst of depressed oil and gas prices and falling output of crude oil and natural gas. Fourth, the openness of small island states extends to their porous coastlines and borders. Historically, this means that these states were vulnerable to military attack. Today, these states are vulnerable to drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other threats to national security. Fifth, because these are nation states, they must have the minimum elements of sovereignty present. There must be an executive with government ministries responsible for planning and infrastructure and health and education and so on. There must be a parliament and the associated capacity to write and to promulgate law. There must be a judiciary along with courthouses and supporting services. There must be law enforcement, which means a police force and police stations, prisons, fire services. What all this means is that the size of the public sector is proportionately larger in small island states than it is in bigger territories, where economies of scale in the provision of government services can be obtained. There are also public sector activities which may or may not be present, or which may be shared with other states. Central banks, for example, are not absolutely necessary if the state opts to use a currency of another country, for example, the United States dollar or the euro, so that countries like Curacao and St. Martin, for example, have been debating whether or not they should dollarize. Ports and airports may be in private hands or in the public sector, but the management of the airspace and maritime exclusive economic zone are the responsibilities of the state. Defense forces may or may not be necessary, although with the menace of drug trafficking, small island states have found it at least necessary to have a Coast Guard or Marine Police Service. So those are the stylized facts on small island states, which tend to suggest that they have significant disabilities. Now, there is an extensive literature on the suggested effects of size on economic growth and development in the Caribbean. Several of our distinguished economists, Arthur Lewis, the Nobel laureate, Willie DeMass, and Lloyd Bess, all grappled with the implications of small size. Arthur Lewis, for example, was writing about the development possibilities for the Caribbean islands from the 1940s to the 1970s. And of course, he was, as you might recall, the first president of the Caribbean Development Bank. Lewis focused his mind on the problem of lack of resources and small population size and argued that these territories needed to be export-oriented. He suggested that tactically, exports of manufactured goods would need to be promoted initially by foreign investors who could supply capital and who knew the destination markets for the exports. The Caribbean territories would use the advantage of their low wage costs. Addressing foreign markets would overcome the problem of economies of scale in our small islands. Willie DeMass also emphasized the disabilities of small size in achieving economies of scale in manufacturing, and like Lewis, thought that part of the answer lay in regional integration and regional programming of industrial production. DeMass was a great believer in Caribbean integration, and were he alive today, he would be pained to see the state of CARICOM. Lloyd Best emphasized the importance of management in overcoming the limitations of size. As Best put it, and I quote, "Economic development is a problem of management, of timing, sequencing, and manipulation in an unending effort to perceive or create, and in any case, to exploit a multiplicity of little openings and opportunities." Recent empirical work done by the World Bank has suggested that small size is not a disability at all, and that small states, while they are vulnerable to large swings in income, tend to have higher productivity and may also have higher incomes. They also do not grow any more slowly than larger economies. There is considerable merit, in my view, in this perspective, if only because there are very few small island states among the poorest countries in the world. But this does not mean, in my view, that small island developing states do not need special consideration from the international community in respect of policies on trade, intellectual property, stabilization and adjustment, and in confronting military aggression, as we have seen most recently in Guyana. So let me turn now to what I consider to be the 6 keys to viability and sustainability. What does this examination of small states tell us as we look at these states over time and across the world? First, proximity or linkage to larger states seems to be significant. The more remote the state, the less likely it is to be successful. Proximity or embedding means that the small state benefits from a single economic space, which allows it to overcome diseconomies of scale and also allows easier access to human capital. And I will come back again and again to this question of human capital. Singapore is a stone's throw away from Malaysia. In fact, it is now separated by a causeway. They can drive across from Singapore into Malaysia. And of course, Singapore was once part of the Malayan Federation. It is also very close to Indonesia. Andorra, Malta, Cyprus, Liechtenstein, even Switzerland benefit from proximity or being embedded in the European Union. Botswana, which is landlocked, benefits from its proximity to wealthier and resource-rich South Africa, in contrast to Malawi, which is also landlocked, but which is surrounded by countries which are just as poor as it. The second key, there must be good connections, air and sea, and good connectivity, that is electronic, between the small island states and other states. The challenge, however, is that airports, seaports, airlines, and telecoms infrastructure are all capital intensive and expensive to build and to maintain. And small markets may not be sufficiently attractive to telecoms companies to deliver high-quality services at reasonable cost. However, innovations in technology are promising the delivery of high-speed internet access to the most remote places. So that companies like Google and Facebook are in fact pioneering some of these technologies to be delivered in places like Africa. Third, and we've heard a lot about this morning, there must be high worker productivity and excellence in the delivery of service. If you are in the tourism business, as many small island states are, then in a world where there is fierce competition for tourist dollars, the quality of service must stand out. Similarly, if you are in niche manufacturing, the quality of your product must be first class. Reputations are easily lost, and in small states, the impact of lost business can be devastating. So to illustrate, the Swiss are noted for the precision of their clocks and watches, as well as the precision of their train services. But Swiss banking, long noted for its secrecy, is now being challenged by countries seeking to get back the proceeds of crime, corruption, and tax evasion which have been lodged in Swiss banks. Fourth, there must be competent and disciplined management in both the public and private sectors. One important consideration in managerial competence, which may be overlooked, is that competence requires a critical mass of talented individuals. I am going to say that again. One important consideration in managerial competence, which may be overlooked, is that competence requires a critical mass of talented individuals. American businesses have created the cult of the CEO, to which is attributed all the insight and talent in driving success. Corporate reality is quite different, as it is in the public sector, and indeed in most human endeavor. Success depends on teamwork, and effective teams need to have critical mass of skills commensurate with the complexity of the problems they are solving. I'll repeat that again. Effective teams need to have a critical mass of skills commensurate with the complexity of the problems they are solving. If you have a complex engineering problem, it is not good enough just to have one Professor Sinclair King. You need to have 10 or 20 of them. Right? Given that the problems of small island states face are no less complex than those faced in larger, more developed economies, getting to critical mass of brain power is a major challenge. It is precisely for this reason that Arthur Lewis advocated utilizing foreign capital and management to get industrialization off the ground. It is not that he thought that the local capitalists were not good enough or were not competent, but that you needed to have enough of them with enough capacity. The aspect of discipline is equally important. It is imperative to avoid what my late brother Trevor called two-story ignorance. That is, where we do not know what we do not know. And we fail to seek or we ignore professional advice. Small states should not be carried away by trying to emulate developed countries and to implement grandiose projects which are beyond their current resources or capabilities. You don't need 20-story buildings to say that you are developed. Washington, D.C., by the way, has no 20-story buildings. All right? Failures in small island economies are more costly than in larger, more developed countries because small countries simply cannot afford to waste resources. Let me say that again. Failures in small island economies are more costly than in larger, more developed countries because small countries simply cannot afford to waste scarce resources. Fifth, in respect of sustainability, it helps, of course, if natural disasters are infrequent, and we are very, very lucky in Trinidad and Tobago as far as that is concerned, as far as hurricanes are concerned, though not necessarily earthquakes. And it is imperative that projects implemented in every area, housing, agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, hotel resorts, are sensitive to the environmental impact that these projects may have. Sixth, beyond the 5 keys identified, there is a 6th key, which is really a combination of intangible attributes, wits, wisdom, and will, which I would like to explore in a little bit more depth. My emphasis on these reflects my view that beyond the technical economics and so on, beyond management, it is culture which determines the success of nations. So we're talking about wits, wisdom, and will. Now, if we think about the global economy as a jungle, there are lions and tigers, elephants and rhinoceroses, all large animals, and some of them are predatory. But there are also swift cheetahs, scavenging hyenas, and a host of small animals who manage not only to survive, but to thrive among the large ones. Some of these develop parasitic relationships with the large animals. Others live by their wits, quick thinking, alert to danger, whether seen or unseen. Sometimes they're skilled at camouflage, and often fleet of foot, they can run fast. Very interesting that the Chief Secretary made the point that if you want to catch up, you have to run faster. All right? If you have to get away, you have to run faster. These small animals do not pick fights or quarrels with the large ones. But by working together and by tactful engagement and diplomacy, they can defend and promote their interests. An excellent example of this is the Treaty on the Law of the Sea, which established sovereignty over the exclusive economic zone extending from the coastlines of all nations. It is this treaty which allows Trinidad and Tobago to claim the oil and gas resources which lie up to 200 miles offshore. The initiative in the United Nations to institute exclusive economic zones was taken by Malta. And Caribbean countries, including Trinidad and Tobago diplomats, Lennox Bala among many others, played important roles in establishing the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Small countries can do big things on the global stage. So we need to live by our wits. We also need to live with our wisdom. Like integrity, wisdom is a word which is difficult to define with precision, but we know it when we see it in action. Wisdom is surely the product of experience, of having seen and reflected on a variety of circumstances and on the decisions and actions of a variety of people in the world, and developing some deep insight which allows one to make a judgment about a current situation or problem. I believe that a key aspect of that is how well the situation is understood for what it really is, not wishful thinking for what we might like it to be. Small states must know that they are small and what smallness means in particular contexts. I think that this means that we need to be more cerebral and more calculating. This does not mean being slow. In fact, one has to evaluate quickly and act decisively. But in between acting, one must assess, evaluate, and develop alternative plans for what might lie ahead. Small states must therefore invest heavily in forward thinking. Small states cannot afford to be lazy and flabby. They need to be lean and lithe. Small states cannot afford to be grasshoppers, flitting merrily when the sun is shining, but catching hell when it rains. We must be like ants, industrious and hardworking, carefully storing up surpluses for the lean times which might just be around the corner. An excellent example of this is Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the equivalent of our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Their fund was started in 1990, about 20 years after Norway became an oil and gas exporting country, and is intended to counter the effects of cyclical fluctuations in oil and gas prices and invest in a variety of assets globally. Norway's fund now stands at $850 billion US. This is about 170,000 US dollars or 1 million TT dollars for every man, woman, and child in Norway. Our fund was started in 2005, although we had been producing oil and gas for 100 years, and amounts only to 28,000 TT dollars for each one of us. Which country, Norway or Trinidad and Tobago, is better placed to withstand a prolonged period of low oil and gas prices? So wits, wisdom, and now will. And by will, I refer to that hard-to-define quality that leaders must have. It is the will to succeed. It is what comes through when you read the autobiography of the late Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. He was leading a country that had been overrun by the Japanese in World War II, was beset by communists, a country that was described as a mosquito-infested swamp, whose per capita income in 1962 was lower than Trinidad and Tobago's. But Lee Kuan Yew had a clear understanding of Singapore's limitations, but an equally clear understanding of its strategic location. He developed a clear vision of what it could become and had a steely determination to achieve the goals the nation set for itself. Now, everything I have said to this point applies to Trinidad and Tobago as to any small island developing country. So how do we stack up in terms of these 6 keys? And this is my own rating, and you may rate it differently. In respect of our proximity and economic space and a single economic space, I rate us high. So it's low, medium, and high. In respect of connections and connectivity, I give us a medium rating, and some of you may dispute that because when the ferry is late or when Carl doesn't get you here on time, you may dispute that. But I want to assure you that our connections are not as bad. You have to travel up the islands in the rest of the Caribbean, and you'll see what bad is. In respect of high worker productivity and service excellence, low. Management competence and discipline, I give it a low. I got a couple of mediums. Sensitivity to the environment, I have that as a low. And for wit, wisdom, and will, I hadn't decided. So, on to the question of making success of internal self-government. What might be the lessons for Tobago, a territory of 116 square miles with a resident population of 60,000 as it moves towards internal self-government? First, it is imperative that Tobago maintains the significant advantage of its geographical location and position within the Trinidad and Tobago economic space and the CARICOM economic space. It must remain open to external capital, including human capital and external management. It would be a mistake to close the door to non-Tobagonians. Not that there's any intention to do so, but I'm just saying it would be a mistake to do that. Obviously, with a protected forest reserve, beachfronts, which must be protected and preserved, and the need to maintain a reasonable agricultural base, Tobago needs to institute a special regime in respect of its limited land space. That means that the matter of sorting out our land titles becomes all the more urgent, and there must also be a sensible policy on land acquisition and land use, which must be developed. Second, it makes economic sense to continue to share institutions wherever possible. While there is, in my view, no need for law courts separate from Trinidad's, there is a good case for a police service separate from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. The government has already signaled its intention to allow the regional corporations to have their own police, and of course the Tobago House of Assembly falls into that. As a separate island dependent on tourism, the police service here will have to be trained differently, consistent with the Service Excellence Initiative. I think in 3 years, it is possible to have a constabulary operational with the senior ranks recruited from university graduates in a variety of disciplines, including management and science and technology, and sent for training overseas, not to Trinidad, overseas, while the lower ranks are recruited from young men and women with good CXC and CAPE certificates and trained in modern policing. Strong governance and discipline of the Tobago Police Service should be instituted from the very start and maintained. It must be that when tourists and Trinis alike arrive in Tobago, they encounter an island where the standards of behavior are clearly and palpably higher, and where there is zero tolerance for crime and lawlessness, which is not just old talk, but we mean it. In respect of productivity and service excellence, the Secretary of Finance and Enterprise Development announced an initiative in his budget statement last June, reflecting the Assembly's recognition that this is critically important for Tobago's success. And we've had it repeated this morning, not just in tourism, but in every aspect of business on the island. Again, when tourists and Trinis arrive in Tobago, they must experience a level of service, of courtesy and respect, of civility, of willingness to assist that should be remarkable. It is that level of service excellence which will make people want to do business in Tobago. The Service Excellence Initiative is conceived as island-wide across the public and private sector and civil society and across all age groups. Everyone needs to get on board. It is perhaps a tired cliche, but in service-oriented countries, service is not servitude. Management competence and discipline in both the public and private sector need to be improved. I don't say that the public sector is bad and the private sector isn't. Both are bad. Education is part of the answer to that. We know that by the current performance measures in SEA and CXC results, Tobago is lagging. But our national performance standards in education are false, driven as they are by the scholarship syndrome, which has been with us for a century now, and which has failed to develop the potential of our children and to leaven management competence and business leadership as might have been expected. Part of the reason, of course, is that many of our young people, the best and the brightest, go abroad, never to return. But Tobago has not inconsiderable access to managerial competence in persons who are accustomed to disciplined action. Recall that some of Trinidad and Tobago's leading public servants, Doddridge Alleyne, the late Victor Bruce, Hart Edwards, were Tobagonians. Tobago has produced 2 prime ministers now, 1 president, who was also prime minister, a chief justice, outstanding attorneys like Russell Martineau, and outstanding academics and thinkers like Susan Craig and the late Carol Keller. There are Tobagonians in senior positions of responsibility in multinational corporations here and abroad. Tobago needs to tap into that talent pool in a systematic way. It is not only about an appeal to patriotism and emotion. I think that the way to do it most effectively would be to concentrate the experience and minds of those Tobagonians in the diaspora around specific issues with which the THA needs to grapple. And those sons and daughters of Tobago will surely be able to attract resources from their own professional networks to help solve the problems, formulate policy, and ensure that at all costs we avoid the sin of two-story ignorance. I would like to conclude by focusing on Tobago's political and business elite and the leadership that they are required to exercise, their wits, their wisdom, and their will. Obviously, part of the rationale for internal self-government is that Tobago is, in some respects, culturally distinct from Trinidad. Its incorporation into Trinidad and Tobago over 100 years ago, and by the way, people don't understand, and I don't know, the history books don't get it, still don't get it right. There's a unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago was never a ward of Trinidad. That is incorrect. It was a ward in Trinidad and Tobago. Huge difference. Right? Trinidad was not guardian of Tobago. The country was divided into wards, hence wardens' offices. And Tobago was a ward in Trinidad and Tobago, not a ward of Trinidad and Tobago. Its incorporation into Trinidad and Tobago brought benefits, but I think in recent decades it has brought some downsides. Tobagonians were noted for their thrift, self-reliance, and strong community spirit. They were courteous and civic-minded. They were, like Teacher Percy, disciplined and responsible. I sense that some of those qualities have eroded over time. Tobago's leaders in politics, business, and civil society have to regain and to restore those values. Development for Tobago, as for Trinidad and Tobago, must mean, first and foremost, human development, creating the environment and the means for the realization of our human potential, individually and collectively. Tobago's leaders must therefore live and exemplify those traditional values and virtues of focus on human development, thrift, service, and avoidance of conspicuous consumption and prestige projects. Finally, I do not know whether the national community has as yet begun to appreciate the significance of the local government reform and emphasis on rural development which the government of Trinidad and Tobago has now launched. These proposed reforms arise from the principle of subsidiarity, which is one of the foundational principles of the European Union, whereby power and authority is devolved to the lowest level capable of exercising that power and authority responsibly, with integrity, and with accountability. The proposed reforms also embrace the idea of participatory democracy, where people in their communities and regions take responsibility for what is happening there and have a say in what is to be done and what is not to be done. This will significantly reduce the power of patronage exercised by central government ministers and will help to significantly reduce corruption in our society. This is the first time in the history of this country, pre or post-independence, where the central executive, the prime minister, the ministers are deliberately giving up meaningful power to institutions at the local and regional level. But the principle of subsidiarity requires that the institutions at the local level have the capability to exercise the power and authority properly, or else the power is better left at the central government level. In this process of devolution, Tobago must again lead and show the way for all of Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago must lead in taking responsibility, in building the capability to exercise power, in accountability, in integrity, in inclusiveness, and in respectful engagement of the population of Tobago. I have no doubt that the people of Tobago will, as you have done so often, take the lead and show Trinidad and Tobago the way to a productive, diversified, service-oriented economy through strong leadership characterized by wit, wisdom, and an indomitable will to succeed. I thank you.